Racist officer throw acid container. On to 8-year-old black boy, face unaware his father is general. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of summer rain, the pavement still damp from a passing storm, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant hum of cicadas. The neighborhood lay in quiet stillness, the homes lined neatly along the suburban street, their porches adorned with warm lights that flickered gently in the night breeze. Street lamps cast long, wavering shadows, stretching like thin fingers across the cracked sidewalks. The world in this moment was still, deceptively peaceful, as if time itself had settled into a lull. But for young Malik Carter, the night would soon turn into an abyss of unbearable agony, a horror beyond anything an innocent child should ever endure. Malik was only 8 years old, a boy untouched by the darkness of the world, his small frame moving energetically across the front yard, his laughter ringing through the night like the sound of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. His world was still one of adventure and dreams, where monsters lived only in bedtime stories, safely tucked away within the pages of books his mother read to him. He was still unaware that true monsters walked in daylight, that they wore uniforms meant to symbolize safety, that evil did not always appear with snarling fangs, but sometimes hid behind cold eyes and cruel intentions. His father, General Desmond Carter, was away, caught in the endless duties of his high-ranking position in the military. A man of discipline, of unwavering authority, he was well respected, feared even, by those who knew the power he held. But at that moment, he was just a father absent from the one place he was needed most. Inside the house, Malik's mother prepared dinner, humming softly to herself, oblivious to the silent predator that watched her son from the street. She had no reason to fear. This was their home, their safe space, a place where her child was meant to grow without fear, without pain. But safety is often an illusion, and tonight, that illusion was about to shatter into something monstrous. Officer Raymond Kessler had been circling the neighborhood for days, his patrol car moving slowly along the familiar streets, his gaze sweeping over the homes like a vulture waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had always been drawn to this neighborhood, though not for any reason that could be justified by his badge. His presence was not one of protection, but one of possession, a man who saw himself as the enforcer of an unwritten order, a keeper of his own twisted sense of control. Something had festered within him for years, a loathing so deep it had poisoned every fiber of his being, turning him into something worse than a villain, something remorseless. His hatred was cold and calculated, and when he saw Malik, something inside him twisted with an urge so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that he acted without hesitation, without doubt, without even the pretense of fear that he might be caught. He did not care. There was no hesitation in the way he reached into the back of his patrol car, fingers wrapping around the thick plastic handle of a container filled with something meant to dissolve, to corrode, to consume. It was industrial-strength acid, a substance so volatile that it could strip flesh from bone in mere moments. It had no place in the hands of an officer, no legitimate reason to be within his possession. And yet, here it was, its purpose now something far worse than any metal it was designed to eat through. With slow, deliberate steps, Kessler moved towards the boy, his boots pressing heavily into the damp earth, crushing the soft grass beneath his heels. Malik had not yet noticed him, his young mind too wrapped in the joy of his play, too absorbed in the simple delights of childhood. But then, as if sensing a shift in the air, Malik turned, his dark eyes lifting to meet the figure that now loomed over him. There was a brief moment of silence, a flicker of confusion in those wide eyes, the kind of confusion that came when the world failed to make sense. And then, before Malik could react, before he could understand, before his small body could even register the instinct to run, the liquid was upon him. The acid struck his face first, a torrent of horror unleashed from the container in Kessler's grasp. It met his soft skin with a hiss, an unnatural sound that cut through the air like the first spark of a fire on dry wood. And then, the pain. The agony was instant, an unbearable, searing torment that exploded through every nerve in his small frame. His body convulsed as the liquid ate through his delicate flesh, sizzling as it seeped into his pores, melting the innocence from his skin, stripping him of everything he once was. His screams, high-pitched and raw, shattered the tranquility of the night, slicing through the silence with the force of something primal, something born of suffering too great to contain. Malik's small hands flew to his face, fingers clawing at his own burning flesh, trying to rid himself of the agony that refused to loosen its grip. The acid did not stop, did not grant him even a moment of mercy. It continued its cruel work, eating into the tender skin of his cheeks, his forehead, his lips. It dripped down his arms, his clothing offering no shield, no salvation, as it burned through fabric and into the thin flesh beneath. His legs gave out beneath him, his small body crumpling onto the grass that had moments ago been his playground. But there was no playground now, only the unbearable heat of destruction, the irreversible damage being done with each passing second. Inside the house, his mother's hands froze mid-motion, her breath catching in her throat as the sound of her child's agony reached her ears. A mother knows the cries of her child, knows every tone, every note of distress. But this was something else. This was not the sound of a scraped knee or a childish fear. This was horror, something so unnatural, so piercing, that it sent terror clawing through her chest. She ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she rushed towards the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then she saw him. Her baby, her little boy, lay writhing on the ground, his small frame twisting in unnatural ways, his fingers curled into tight fists as his skin blistered, as the acid ate into his flesh with relentless hunger. She did not recognize him. Her own child, the boy she had carried, nurtured, loved beyond words. His face, the soft features she had kissed every night, was now a grotesque horror of melted flesh, a patchwork of red, raw agony. His lips were torn apart, his cheeks bubbling, his eyes squeezed shut, though the acid had already begun to claim them. And then there was Kessler. He stood above Malik, unmoved, unaffected, his expression cold and empty, as if what he had just done was no different than stepping on a bug. There was no flicker of guilt, no hesitation in his posture, no regret in his gaze. He had done what he had set out to do, and now he simply watched, as if waiting to see just how long it would take for the acid to finish its work. Malik's mother let out a sound that was not human. A scream ripped from the depths of her soul, raw and jagged, an explosion of grief so great that it could have shattered the sky itself. She fell to her knees, reaching for her son, her hands desperate to touch him, to comfort him, but she could not. His body was untouchable, a searing landscape of agony that could no longer bear the embrace of a mother's love. And in that moment, beneath the indifferent gaze of the man who had done this, beneath the darkness of a night that should have been peaceful, the world of Malik Carter and everyone who loved him came crumbling down. The hospital reeked of antiseptic and quiet suffering, the kind of place where pain lingered not only in the bodies of the wounded but in the very walls, soaked into the sterile white tiles and fluorescent lights that hummed like distant ghosts. The halls were filled with hushed voices, murmured discussions of patients fighting battles both seen and unseen, but behind the doors of Malik Carter's room, there was no quiet, no peace. There was only the ceaseless beeping of machines, the sterile cold of an environment that sought to preserve life, and the scent of burnt flesh that refused to fade, no matter how many times the nurses cleaned the room. The damage had been done. The scars had been set. And for the boy lying beneath the thin hospital sheets, there was no waking from this nightmare. Malik's small body trembled as machines pumped medication through his veins, numbing what little pain could still be dulled. The doctors had done what they could, but there was no reversing the horrors that had been inflicted upon him. His face was now a grotesque landscape of melted flesh, his once soft and unblemished skin now a ruined wasteland of scar tissue and raw agony. Where his bright, innocent eyes had once been, there was now only clouded damage, a dullness that spoke of irreversible destruction. The acid had not simply burned him, it had stolen him, had consumed his very identity, leaving behind only a shell of the boy who had once laughed beneath the setting sun. His right arm had fared no better. The acid had eaten through layers of skin, peeling away his flesh as if it were nothing more than fragile bark stripped from a dying tree. The doctors had fought to save it, to salvage what they could, but the damage had reached deep, exposing bone in places where no child's body should ever be laid bare. Bandages covered his wounds, but they could not hide the truth. The truth that the boy who lay there was no longer the same child who had once run across his front yard without fear. He was something else now, something molded by the cruelty of a man who had not seen him as human, who had seen fit to erase his very existence with a single, merciless act. Outside the room, nurses whispered to each other in hushed voices, their eyes filled with horror and sympathy, but none dared linger for too long. The sight was too much to bear. There were some tragedies that settled deep into the bones, that clung to the soul like an unshakable weight, and this was one of them. Malik Carter was only 8 years old, yet he had suffered more than most would in a lifetime. And then his father arrived. General Desmond Carter did not enter the hospital like an ordinary man. He arrived in a storm, a force of nature barely contained, his presence filling every hallway he passed through, demanding the attention of all who dared stand in his path. The door slammed open as he strode through, his face set in an expression of barely controlled rage, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might crack beneath the pressure. His uniform was still immaculate, his presence still commanding, but there was something different in his eyes, something that had never been there before. He had faced death. He had stared into the abyss of war, had watched men fall in battle, had led soldiers through fire and blood. He had heard the dying gasps of comrades, had stood over the bodies of those who had given their lives for their country. But nothing had prepared him for the sight that awaited him beyond the doors of that hospital room. His steps faltered for the first time in his life when he saw his son. His knees, so accustomed to standing firm, nearly buckled beneath him as his mind struggled to reconcile the broken body before him with the boy he had once known. Malik had always been small, always been fragile in a way that only children could be, but now he looked even smaller, swallowed by the white sheets, his figure barely rising with each shallow breath. Desmond stepped forward, his movement slow, deliberate, as if he feared that getting too close would make this nightmare all too real. He had trained his entire life to be a man of control, to keep his emotions in check, to face any situation with unwavering discipline. But this was different. This was his son. This was Malik. His wife sat beside the bed, her body hunched over, her fingers wrapped tightly around Malik's small, damaged hand. Her sobs were quiet now, reduced to broken breaths and trembling shoulders, but her grief was palpable, saturating the air with a weight that threatened to crush them all. She did not lift her head when Desmond entered, did not acknowledge his presence, because there were no words left to say. There was only pain, only the unrelenting torment of a mother who had been forced to watch her child suffer in ways no mother should ever have to witness. Desmond reached out, his hand trembling as he touched Malik's forehead. His fingers barely grazed the bandages, barely brushed against the ruined skin that had once been so soft beneath his touch. He had always been a man of action, a man who fixed things, who took control, who never let a problem go unresolved. But now, he was powerless. Now, he was nothing but a father who had failed to protect his son. The truth came in slow waves, crashing against him with a force he could not contain. He learned of the officer responsible. He learned of Raymond Kessler, of the man who had done this, of the cruelty that had been inflicted upon his child without hesitation, without remorse. And with that truth, something inside Desmond Carter snapped. For years he had served a country that had promised justice, a system that had sworn to protect its people. He had worn his uniform with pride, had fought for the ideals of honor and integrity, had believed in the very institutions that now stood silent in the wake of his son's suffering. But now he saw the truth. Now he saw the rot that had spread through the core of everything he had once believed in. This system had allowed monsters to wear badges, had turned a blind eye to the evils that lurked within its ranks, had permitted men like Raymond Kessler to act without consequence, without fear. But Malik was not just any child. Malik was Desmond Carter's son, and Desmond Carter was not a man who let injustice stand. Retribution was inevitable. As he stood there, staring at the ruined remains of his boy, something dark took root in his chest, something deeper than rage, more consuming than hatred. It was a promise, one that settled into his bones, one that would not allow itself to be ignored. He would not wait for the courts to fail him. He would not wait for justice to be twisted and denied, for evidence to be buried, for excuses to be made. Raymond Kessler had made a mistake. He had not simply harmed a child. He had declared war on a man who had spent his life mastering the art of war. And war was what he would receive. Officer Kessler had been taken into custody, but it was little more than a performance, a carefully orchestrated illusion meant to pacify the enraged voices demanding justice. The system moved with calculated apathy, its wheels grinding slowly, deliberately, ensuring that the weight of accountability never truly fell upon those it was meant to protect. The press release was crafted with precision, the official statements carefully worded, twisting the narrative into something palatable for the public. Kessler was not a monster, not a man who had permanently disfigured an innocent child. He was simply an officer who had acted in self-defense against a suspicious individual. The words hung in the air like poison, a justification molded from the same rot that had allowed countless others to walk free. Desmond Carter had seen this play out before. He had witnessed firsthand how the system operated, how justice was bent and contorted until it no longer resembled the truth. He had fought wars under the belief that his country stood for something greater, that it held itself to a higher standard, that it did not abandon its own. But now, as he watched from the shadows, as he saw evidence being buried, witnesses being silenced, he understood the futility of believing in anything other than action. Kessler walked free within days, his bail posted with little resistance. His return to the world met not with consequence, but with quiet protection from those who saw him as one of their own. Desmond did not speak when he saw the headlines shift, when the news outlets began running stories that painted Kessler as a man caught in an unfortunate situation, a victim of a misunderstanding rather than a perpetrator of unimaginable cruelty. He did not argue when officials dismissed concerns, when they delayed hearings, when they pretended the outrage would die down if given enough time. He simply watched, his silence carrying the weight of something far more dangerous than anger. This time, he was not a bystander. This time, the monster had come for his son. There would be no trial, no leniency, no waiting. Desmond moved through the darkness with a predator's grace, his steps silent, his intent sharpened to a lethal point. His years in the military had given him the tools he needed, had molded him into something precise, something relentless. He was a man who had spent his life hunting threats to his country, dismantling dangers before they could ever reach innocent lives. Now, that same expertise was focused on one man. Kessler had made the mistake of believing himself untouchable, of thinking the badge he wore would shield him from the consequences of his actions. He did not yet realize that he had provoked something far worse than an investigation. He had declared war on a man who had built his life upon the art of war. Desmond had no need for inquiries or surveillance reports. His contacts within the military ensured that every detail of Kessler's life was laid bare before him. He knew where he lived, where he slept, where he retreated when the weight of his sins became too heavy to ignore. He studied the officer's movements with the patience of a seasoned hunter, memorizing his patterns, his habits, his moments of vulnerability. Kessler had returned to his life with arrogant ease, his sense of security unshaken by the horrors he had inflicted. He did not yet understand that his days of safety had ended the moment he had decided to steal a child's face. The night Desmond found him, there was no hesitation. The house was quiet, a single-story structure nestled within a forgotten part of the city, its windows darkened, its walls thick enough to keep secrets buried. Kessler had chosen a place where no one would come looking, where he could fade into the background until the world had moved on. But Desmond was already inside before the officer ever sensed he was not alone. Kessler never heard the approach, never saw the shadow that loomed behind him as he moved through the dimly lit space. The air was thick with the staleness of a life lived without remorse, the kind of emptiness that clung to men who had long abandoned the weight of their conscience. By the time Kessler realized something was wrong, by the time his instinct screamed at him to turn, to reach for his weapon, to run, by then it was too late. There were no words exchanged, no pleas, no explanations, just the slow, deliberate actions of a father delivering judgment. The morning news carried the story with an air of detached curiosity, the kind reserved for incidents that would soon be forgotten. Officer Raymond Kessler had disappeared without a trace. There were no leads, no suspects, only speculation whispered through the channels of media outlets, desperate to fill their morning segments. The reporters spoke of his vanishing as an unfortunate mystery, their words laced with careful neutrality, as if his absence was nothing more than an inconvenience rather than a consequence. The department issued a brief statement expressing concern, but there were no real investigations, no real questions. His fellow officers lowered their voices when speaking of him, glancing over their shoulders as if sensing an unseen presence lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding. But no one searched for him. No one truly cared. The world moved on, as it always did. Malik, however, could not move on. He remained trapped in a body that no longer felt like his own, confined to an existence that had been reshaped by the hands of cruelty. His hospital room had become a space of quiet dread, a place where the sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with the unshakable presence of suffering. The bandages that covered his face and arms were changed daily, each careful removal revealing the grotesque reality beneath. His skin, once smooth and youthful, had been stolen from him, replaced by a labyrinth of scar tissue that twisted and puckered across his fragile frame. The doctors had done what they could, but there were limits to healing, limits to medicine, limits to what could be undone. Some things were permanent. Some things would never be erased. The mirror had become his greatest enemy. He refused to look at his reflection, refused to acknowledge the truth that waited for him in the glass. The few times he had caught glimpses, the horror had been too much to bear. His once bright eyes were now clouded, damaged beyond repair, their warmth dimmed by the cruelty that had consumed him. The soft features of his childhood had been stolen, reshaped by fire and pain, twisted into something unrecognizable. His lips, once curved by laughter, had melted into uneven shapes, distorted by the acid's merciless hunger. There were places where the flesh had fused together, where the burns had turned him into something less than human, something that no longer fit within the image of who he used to be. There was no waking up from this nightmare. His body ached constantly, a dull throb that never truly faded, a reminder that the past still lingered beneath his skin. Sleep did not offer an escape, for even in his dreams, the pain followed him. He still felt the searing heat of the acid, still heard the hiss of it as it consumed him, still lived through the moment where his innocence had been stolen in a wave of unimaginable agony. His mind played the scene over and over, trapping him in an endless loop of suffering. He would wake up screaming, his voice hoarse, his fingers clawing at the bandages as if trying to peel away the reality that had been forced upon him. Desmond Carter sat by his son's side every night, his presence a constant, unwavering force in the midst of Malik's shattered world. He would watch over him in the darkness, his posture rigid, his fingers wrapped around the fragile hand that barely held his own. He had never been a man given to softness, had never been one to linger in emotion, but with Malik, there was no other choice. His son had been broken, had been stripped of everything that made him who he was, and now all Desmond could do was be there, to be the unmovable rock against the tide of Malik's suffering. He whispered to him in the quiet of the night, his voice low, steady, as if his words alone could keep the nightmares at bay. He made promises, vows that no harm would ever come to Malik again, that no one would ever touch him, that he would never have to fear the world outside these walls. But even as he spoke, as he tried to stitch together the fragments of a shattered childhood, Desmond knew the truth. Some wounds never heal. Some scars, no matter how much time passes, remain etched into the soul, refusing to fade. The world had already taken too much from Malik Carter, but it would never take anything again,